responsible for the production and distribution of ideas. That is because we recognize that we are in a serious contest of ideas with our oppressors. And for the most part, we've been relatively unarmed. So it's really important, this work that we see happening with these comrades who are taking this on. And I just wanted to recognize how significant we think this is. It is also important that we talk about Malcolm X. Yes. This kind of meeting, or meetings similar to this, will be happening throughout this country. Every May, almost every February, which was the date of Malcolm's assassination, groups of people hold meetings to discuss Malcolm X. And I think that at this moment in history, where we're seeing an obvious failure of a social system that's born of oppression, born of murder, slavery. I'm talking about the whole capitalist system, the world capitalist system that gave birth to what we now call Europe and what we now call North America. But what is obvious to most people on earth, that this system is experiencing a critical failure. Crisis abounds everywhere. There is a season of unending war. Even people who get Nobel Peace Prizes are leading this horrible war machine, murdering people around the world. I'm talking about like Barack Hussein Obama, that's authorizing drone strikes, killing innocent people, bombing weddings and funerals, and assassinating individuals that this government has put on a target list. It seems that the only thing that's necessary in Washington, D.C. is somebody writes a name down on a piece of paper and say that this person is a terrorist, this person deserves to die, this person deserves to be chased across the planet and arrested. They don't just do that internationally, they do that in communities throughout this country, where Eric Holder, not too long ago, went into, I don't remember if it was Oakland, California, another city, could have been Chicago, and validated this process they have where local district attorneys have the ability of designating some individual a gang member. And based on this designation that comes from the government, this person cannot be in certain locations in the city. And if the person is found in a certain location, that alone is enough to arrest a person and to arrest anybody who happens to be with that person. So this targeting of people in Afghanistan and Pakistan, in Northern Africa, by the United States government is not something that it simply does outside of this country. An article was in the newspaper not too long ago, and they're still talking about it as if it were some extraordinary event, has described Tampa as a place that is notorious for just giving tickets and arresting African people simply for riding on bicycles. I didn't know Tampa was notorious for that. I thought St. Petersburg was notorious for that. I thought Philadelphia was notorious for that. Every place where we look throughout this country, you also see a kind of targeting. A targeting of people that has allowed the United States government or the city of New York to stop and search 850,000 men, mostly Africans and what they call Latinos. Stop and search them, 850,000. Some 250,000 stopped and searched in Philadelphia. And then, of course, if you happen to be walking down the street at the wrong time, in Ferguson, Missouri, you're targeted, gunned down, or if you're a child in Cleveland, Ohio, in a playground with a play gun, you are subject to be targeted. Or if you're a 7-year-old child sleeping in her bed in Detroit, you're subject to be murdered, targeted in the same way. So what we're looking at is a really exacerbated moment in history where this crisis is abounding, where the United States, which is the leading imperialist power in the world, even if shakily so, is in fighting for its very life, because it's a life that requires the oppression of the vast majority of people on earth for its success. It is an incredibly important moment. And I mention this because when we talk about Malcolm X, I think it's necessary to know that we are talking about his birthday and to know that the significance of Malcolm X is not that he was born on that particular day so much as he is representative of a particular point, a particular period in time, and a particular people, a whole people that suffers extreme brutality in this social system. Malcolm X, most of us know, was born on May 19, 1925. It is worth noting that the date of his birth, the year of his birth, was the same year that the United States government jailed Marcus Garvey. Malcolm X's father and mother were followers of the movement led by Marcus Garvey that was called the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League. It was a movement that raised the slogan, Africa for Africans, those at home and those abroad. It was a movement that recognized that black people stretched across the globe were in a condition that was imposed on us by external forces, by hostile forces, by Europe, by white power, by America, and that our future had to be one that resulted in coming to power on our own terms. We have to be a self-governing, free people. And it is the family that Malcolm X grew into, was born into, at a really important time. I mentioned this was the year that Garvey was jailed, which is to say that it was a year of extreme repression in this country. That was 1925. We can go to 1915, the so-called Red Summer, at a time where whites initiated violent riots in particular cities throughout this country, murdering scores of African people. In 1921, the United States government initiated the first aerial bombardment in the Western Hemisphere, military bombardment. And that was bombing in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that destroyed African community and black businesses. It was called Black Wall Street. It had become so successful, 1921. So it was an extremely tumultuous period that Malcolm X was born into. He was born just a few years after the success of the Russian Revolution, where a few years after the end of the first imperialist war that people refer to as World War I, there was an incredible transformation that was happening throughout the world. And World War I was a war that was fought by various white powers to redivide the world among themselves. And it was a brutal war. I mean, scores, hundreds of thousands of people died in that war to redivide the world. That's what it was. And I think we need to be clear on that, because we hear all kinds of fairy tales about what these horrible events in history were really about. And so what we need to understand is that these wars that we are talking about, they're like mafia arrangements the whole organization of the world is like an arrangement that mafia forces pull together. And they occasionally have these wars to redivide the world because they don't like their cut. In 1884 and 85, to prevent such a war from happening, European powers got together in a place called Berlin, Germany, where they split up Africa. This Africa that we think we know about was carved up at a table in Germany. No Africans were there. Just white people got together and carved up Africa in order to prevent themselves from going to war among themselves over who was going to get what part of the black world. We weren't there. We weren't included. We were on plantations in Jamaica and Brazil and in Mississippi and Alabama and all those other places that we have been strewn throughout the world. And so there has been this history of Europe going to war with each other, redividing the world. They don't like the arrangements. After a few years, then they go to war again, redivide the world. That's what happened with the Second Imperialist War. Germany felt like it got a bad deal after the First Imperialist War. And it kicked off the Second Imperialist War, again, to redivide the world. We were told, and we get taught this nonsense in our classes, that the war was fought for democracy, etc. That's what we get taught. But how in the hell can a country be fighting a war for democracy when lynching is the national pastime in the same country? How in the hell could America be fighting for democracy when the national pastime in the country was killing black people? Had nothing to do with democracy. It had to do with redividing the world. And they used some of us to participate in that. And I'm just saying this, that we need to understand this era that Malcolm was born into. It was a tumultuous period in history. It was a period of severe repression. Garvey had been jailed. On the same year Malcolm was born, Garvey was thrown into prison. Garvey had organized a movement of 6 to 11 million black people around the world. He had organized a movement under the slogan, Africa for Africans, those at home and those abroad. And you know why that slogan was so important? It was important because this was when the so-called League of Nations, which was a predecessor to the United Nations. The League of Nations was organized, and there was a debate happening among white people about who was going to get what parts of the world and who was going to get part of Namibia, who was going to be the custodians of this and that. And Garvey raised the demand, Africa for Africans. Africa for Africans, those at home and those abroad. And that was the movement that Garvey pushed. And 11 million African people around the world participated in that movement. It was an incredible movement, and some of the people who participated in that movement were Earl and Louise Little, Malcolm X's father, who was a Baptist preacher, but an ardent supporter of Marcus Garvey, and his mother, Louise Little. They had 8 children. Malcolm was one of them. And Malcolm was born in Omaha, Nebraska. And the militant activities of his father resulted in threats and attacks on the family all the time. So they moved from Omaha. Their house was burned. They went into Lansing, Michigan. And when Malcolm was 6 years old, his father was murdered by groups associated with a white nationalist organization that was called the Black Legion. It was like a Ku Klux Klan type organization. His mother and the 8 children were left in a state of destitution. She had to resort to cooking wild greens that grew like you would find in the streets, on the side of the streets and what have you. And it wasn't too long until she had a nervous breakdown. She had a nervous breakdown, and Malcolm and his 7 siblings were separated and sent to different foster care homes and things like that. And Malcolm X ended up, Malcolm Little, as he was named, ended up finally hustling. He became a thief. He was a very brilliant student when he was in school. And he made the mistake of telling his teacher that he wanted to be a lawyer, his favorite teacher. And his favorite teacher told him that no nigger should be aspiring to be a lawyer. You ought to be a carpenter or something like that. They should have let him be a lawyer. And anyway, he ended up becoming a thief, a pimp, and what have you. Now, those are just some of the details about Malcolm's existence. He joined an organization while he was in prison. His brother, Reginald, joined an organization that was led by a man named Elijah Muhammad called the Nation of Islam. Elijah Muhammad is said to have been also a member of the Garvey movement that was destroyed by the United States government. In fact, for all the integrationists in the House, it is worth noting that the FBI was integrated precisely because they needed somebody black to join the Garvey movement to help destroy it. That's a literal truth. And so that was the basis of the whole integration of the FBI. And they worked to destroy the movement by Garvey, and a lot of offshoots from that movement went to different places, people who had been associated with the movement. And one of them was a man whose name that was given to him at birth was Elijah Poole. And he came to be known as Elijah Muhammad. And he was the founder of the Nation of Islam. And so when Malcolm was in prison, his brother had joined the Nation of Islam. They called themselves a nation. They called themselves, and they were, a religious organization that adhered to what they characterized as Islam. And people referred to them as black Muslims. And in fact, for all that you know about Muslims in this country today, it was Africans who brought Islam to this country. Even before Elijah Muhammad, Africans who were brought here in captivity, many of them were Muslims, right? So Malcolm in prison, who considered himself depraved. He was often called Satan by people who knew him. And he was in prison, his brother, and he had begun to study seriously in prison, begun to read everything. He was brilliant even when he was in school. And he began to read everything, study everything. And his brother turned him on to the Nation of Islam. He joined the Nation of Islam, and in short order, after he got out of the Nation of Islam, at the time he joined the Nation of Islam, there was an estimated 500 members. That was in 1952. And by 1962, Malcolm had grown the organization to something like 50,000 members. Malcolm X had initiated the process. Malcolm X initiated, he was made the minister at Mosque number 7. He became the official that was in Harlem. He became the official spokesperson for the Nation of Islam. He began to get columns in the newspaper. He used the Pittsburgh Courier. There's some people who won't be familiar, but it was one of the most significant black newspapers in the country, and even though it came out of Pittsburgh, it was could be found throughout African communities throughout the United States. And he began to write into that newspaper. And other newspapers, he would get columns in there. And Malcolm X, on his table in his basement, made up the first Muhammad Speaks newspaper, which became the official newspaper of the Nation of Islam. So he was an incredible factor in that organization. Now, the Nation of Islam was an important organization. It was important because of its black audacity at a time where so many Africans were cowering in the face of white power, awed by white people, you had an organization that was saying, hey, the white man is the devil. Amen. That was extraordinary. I mean, just think about this. They said this guy is not somebody that you should be in awe of. This white man is so awesome and powerful. The white man is the devil, right? And that struck a serious chord. It frightened some Africans to death to hear somebody talking like that. But even if they didn't like the Muslims, you know, they hid and cheered them on in the closet and what have you. Anybody walking around saying the white man who's bombing us, lynching us, killing us, denying us the ability to live and work, they said this man is the devil. So that's why you're getting lynched by the white man. That's why he's putting drugs and booze in your community, because he's the devil, right? And it was a significant kind of religious, and it struck me. And I said, if I was religious, I'd join the Muslim, because that's the most sensible religious thing I've ever heard. You know, in fact, I did try to join the Nation of Islam when I got out of the military, because I had been struck by Malcolm X. And I first heard of Malcolm X, I was in Berlin, Germany, and picked up a newspaper clipping, and actually a white guy, his name was David Manis, showed me an article that was quoting Malcolm X. It might have been in the New York Times or something like that, a very short article, but it was the boldest statement I had ever heard coming from anybody, right? And so I was in the military myself. And so Malcolm built this organization. He was an incredible force in this organization. And their religious doctrine taught them they were almost materialists. We are materialists as an organization. I don't adhere to any superstition at all. I want people to be freed from superstition. I want people to come to terms with the power that we have as human beings to change the world that we live in, that this is a world that was created by humans, and we have the ability to make this world be what we want it to be. So I'm opposed to any superstition that assumes that some mysterious thing out there is manipulating everything and won't allow us to control our own world and our own future. So I'm not superstitious. But the Nation of Islam came closest. It was a semi-materialist organization. When I say materialist, what I mean is that we believe that the material world is primary. That what you can see, smell, hear, touch, that's the primary world. And that thing that we call spiritual is what makes up our inner self, but it's not the boogeyman spiritual. It's not spookism, as the nation used to characterize stuff like that. It's the way Africans walk. You know what I'm talking about? It's the fact that you don't find anything when you listen to James Brown. If you go and buy the music sheet from James Brown, there's nothing in there that goes, ow, right? That's the spirituality that I'm talking about. I'm talking about that which constitutes the essence of us, of who we are. You know, so Malcolm, the Nation of Islam, and one of its attractions to some people was that it was formerly against what they call spookism. And spookism is that kind of religious stuff where there's all these forces out there someplace, the great white guy, bearded white guy, you know, behind the clouds who, you know, making stuff. They were against that. In fact, as a young person, I went to a meeting at a mosque, and I was struck because the minister was preaching, and he was standing. Behind him on the wall was a U.S. flag turned upside down, and he was standing on the Bible. And it was a real frontal assault on like the belief system that most African people have. It was like a shocking frontal assault. And sometimes you have to assault the consciousness sharply so that people can hear you, because sometimes we can't hear unless it does happen sharply. You know, so Malcolm, so the nation was semi. It was not materialist, but it was not consistently materialist. And for example, it had the story of the creation of the white man from the Nation of Islam, because all white people didn't come normally white. We used to be black when there was this evil scientist called Yakub. Yeah. Right? Isn't that right? You know y'all cool? Y'all cool. The big-headed scientists, y'all cool. Who actually, through a process of genetic engineering, by working and getting Africans and then, making them lighter over a period of time, created the white man, right? This is how it happened. So it makes as much sense as any other religion's story that you can get. And for black people catching hell, I mean, a lot of sense. You understand? Because what it helped us to understand the white man didn't come from the same place we came from. Couldn't have come from the same place we came. Couldn't be doing all this stuff to us and then come from the same place we came from, right? So the nation then was attractive to a lot of Africans because of that and because it was shocking, right? And the other thing that was shocking, that was attractive about the nation of Islam is it called for do for self. It said do for yourself. Stop begging the white man. Do it for yourself. We need, and it put forth the idea that we need to have our own piece of land, set up our own government and stuff like that. And Malcolm went into that organization. And he had a profound influence on the Nation of Islam because he deepened it, because he went beyond simply do for yourself. The Muslims would say, like, you see what you just did to some black people over there, you see that airplane that crashed is because Allah got back to you, and that's made the airplane crash. Didn't have to do nothing. The airplane crashed. You can say Allah did that, right? But Malcolm took it further. And he began to introduce into the Nation of Islam something that you never heard any Muslim say before or since who was a part of the Nation of Islam. Any of them at all. Malcolm began to talk about revolution. Malcolm began to talk about revolution. Malcolm began to talk about revolution not just in the abstract, but as it related to the struggle that was happening on the earth that African people were involved in here and other people were involved in around the world. He began to criticize Martin Luther King. I think it's important to say that because some people like to say King and Malcolm, they just had some different attitudes, except they were all going the same direction. They were not. You just saw briefly, we opened up and showed some part of a play called The Meeting. There were some splendid actors who acted out a part of that. They had cut that play in a certain way so that Malcolm's part in the play was the dominant part in the play because this is, after all, a celebration of the 90th birthday of Malcolm X. And so his role was the dominant role that you just heard. But in the play, actually, you really a unity, an equality of the philosophical views of Malcolm and Martin Luther King in that play as you go through it, but they were not equal. There's a picture that you can find that's almost become iconic, where there's Malcolm and Martin Luther King who bumped into each other and they're standing there shaking hands. And this is something that's now used to show that Malcolm and Martin Luther King, they were really on the same side of the question. And that's not an accurate picture. And I want to say a few things about that. I want to say some things because what is said now is so critically important. Because Malcolm X died, King died, but they didn't simply die in their sleep, they were murdered. And the United States government murdered Martin Luther King, then it murdered Malcolm X, and it murdered members of the Black Panther Party to crush a revolutionary movement that had grown up in this country, that was challenging the United States government to its very foundation. And it wasn't just challenging it here. This movement was an international movement that Malcolm X recognized, Malcolm X talked about. He challenged, he talked about revolution. He said, whoever heard of a revolution that's when the objective is to sit down on the toilet next to white folks? He said, that's no revolution. He said, what kind of revolution is it where you're going to overwhelm them with your capacity to love? He said, revolution is based on land. And the only way you can get it is bloodshed. That you got to fight if you really want freedom. And you got to have your own land. And land is a fundamental question, and Malcolm X was able to articulate that. Why do I say land is important? Because it is important. And everybody in this room and everybody in America knows it's important, or they wouldn't have stolen it from the indigenous people who were the traditional owners of this land right here. They know land is important, so they stole it every place they went. They stole land. They stole it in Africa. They stole it here. They stole it all over the Americas, etc. Land is critical. If you deny people its land, then you deny them the capacity to produce life for themselves, right? And that's what, so Malcolm talked about that this is what revolution is about. And he talked about revolution. He didn't just say we need some land of our own. He said we have to have a revolution. He said there's a difference in the black revolution and the Negro revolution. That's what he said. And when he talked about what revolution really was, he said, look at those people in Vietnam. He said that the white man can't win another war on the ground. Didn't he say that? Hasn't it proved itself out even since then? He said he's powerful in the air, where he got a lot of bombs, and he can drop a lot of bombs, but he can't come down on the ground. He said, look at him in Vietnam. Said he goes to Vietnam. And he said, people, the only thing they got is a blade, a blade. He said, but when the sun goes down, it's even Steven, right? So Malcolm was teaching revolution. He was teaching guerrilla warfare, even. So he wasn't talking, we shall overcome. You know, he wasn't talking about overwhelming them with your capacity to love. He said that if you're going to have a conversation with somebody, you got to speak the same language they speaking. That you're in bad shape. If they speak in English and you speak in French, you are not going to communicate. He said you're dealing with an enemy that only understands violence. You can't approach this enemy speaking the language of peace. You got to deal with this enemy in the language that he understands. That made sense to me. So Malcolm X, he was a critical force at a critical moment. He didn't simply talk in the abstract. He didn't simply talk about religion in the abstract. He talked about revolution. He was a materialist, and he was the only one of them that was introducing revolutionary theory into the struggle, challenging the civil rights movement. He challenged King. He challenged the Big Six. And then he challenged them not because he thought they were sinning and violating some laws of Allah. You won't ever find him saying something about them violating some Muslim principle. He challenged them because they were betraying the African masses. He challenged them because they were leading African people into these massacres and being beaten into the earth. He challenged them because he said that we have to have our own land, have our own resources. This is the struggle that Malcolm X was making with King and the rest of them. So he was just an incredibly important force based on that. So here you got a struggle, an incredible struggle. Civil rights movement. African people come into consciousness, even though the civil rights movement was not created for us. And that's a whole other story that you need to come to terms with, because right now it's critical how we understand history, because we're entering into another period of struggle, not only of African people in this country, but struggles of the peoples around the world, just as what existed during the period of Malcolm X. The question is, where are we going to go? Making speeches ain't going to do it, right? And where are we going to go, and what are we going to have to do to win our freedom? And so Malcolm X was articulating this line, and it began to be a line that disturbed the United States government. But it didn't just disturb the United States government, it disturbed the organization that he was a part of, the Nation of Islam. The nation had a problem. Leaders in the Nation of Islam had a problem. They said Malcolm was moving away from just the religious teaching. Malcolm talking about, oh, was he talking about revolution? He went to Selma. He went into Mississippi and met with the people who were involved in the struggle. He'd get political education from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the ones who came forward with black power. Malcolm X influenced that. So he wasn't just talking some abstract religious stuff. He was talking about how to change the world that we live in. And then he began to make relationships with Africans and Arabs around the world to build revolutionary connections. He spoke before the Organization of African Unity at a time when somebody thought there were some possibilities that it would be something other than that neo-colonial white power in black face entity that it is. He spoke before them. He warned them. He said, you just become free of European colonialism, but you should not walk into the trap of American dollarism. He warned them about this. And so Malcolm was just an incredible force, and he began to shake the nation of Islam too. The leaders of the nation began to say, Malcolm, you're going too far. I forgot the year it was when in Los Angeles, California, the police attacked a mosque and went in and just really brutalized a lot of the Muslims in that mosque. And Malcolm was sent into Los Angeles. Elijah had to bring him out of there. Because Malcolm, this is true. Malcolm wasn't playing. He'd been preaching all along, said you cannot hit Muslims. You cannot attack the Muslims like that. You're attacking these Christians and all that. You cannot attack us like that. So Malcolm went into Los Angeles. And he began speaking in Los Angeles and mobilizing people, and it scared them to death. They had to bring Malcolm out of there. Had to bring him out of there. So he began to shake up all kinds of stuff. And at a certain juncture, this split that was emerging in the Nation of Islam represented itself in the public view when Malcolm X answered a question by the media about the assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, who was then the President of the United States. And Malcolm said something to the effect that I'm an old farm boy myself. He said, looks like the chickens have come home to roost. And that shook up everybody. And Elijah had already said that nobody should say anything about the assassination of Kennedy. Do you know what Malcolm was talking about when he said the chickens have come home to roost? Because Kennedy had recently assassinated the puppet president that they had in power in Vietnam. Everybody in the world knew it. Kennedy this guy wouldn't follow orders. And not that he was trying to be some revolutionary. He was just trying to be all for himself when he should have been all for America. And so Kennedy had him assassinated. Everybody knew it. And so when Kennedy was assassinated, Malcolm said, looks like the chickens have come home to roost. And so that shook up everything, and that was the thing that gave justification for sitting Malcolm down and said he couldn't speak for 90 days. And it was clear soon thereafter that Malcolm was not going to be able to speak anymore. And so Malcolm had begun to organize. And he did several things that I think is important to mention. One thing he did was he made a trip to Mecca. And this was an important trip because some of the Muslims had from other places, in particular in the East, were challenging the legitimacy of the Nation of Islam in terms of the practice, what the Islam that they were practicing. And Malcolm then went to Mecca to make the Hajj, which is something that's compulsory for every Muslim to make the Hajj. And Malcolm made the Hajj. Elijah hadn't made the Hajj. None of the others had made the Hajj. Malcolm made the Hajj, which was important to establish his credentials in the whole Muslim world, one. And then Malcolm came back to the United States, and Malcolm wrote letters before he came back to the United States. He wrote a letter that said that he was amazed because while he was in Mecca, he saw white Muslims. He said he didn't know they were white Muslims. He said they told him there was no such thing. A white man couldn't be a Muslim. Y'all believe Malcolm didn't know it was a white Muslim? You think Malcolm really didn't know? He knew what was going on in Vietnam. He knew what was going on. You think he didn't know there was white Muslims? Malcolm was on a mission. And part of Malcolm's mission was that he had to break and build his new organization, establish new relationships with all kinds of forces in the world. So in order to do that, he had to come up with a kind of justification why he would be breaking the line that had been established by Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam, and still carry much of his base that was in the nation, carry the base as much as he could with him to where he was trying to go. I mean, I knew there was white Muslims, and I know damn well Malcolm X knew there was white Muslims. You understand? But it became necessary. Malcolm is building now. He's scrambling now to build an organization because he's out there on his own, and then he's been followed by the U.S. government, CIA. They poisoned him once while he was on the trip, and then he's been hassled by the Nation of Islam. You know, all kinds of nasty things are being said about him, calling him in the middle of the night. All this stuff is going on with Malcolm X. So he's scrambling. So one day he organizes what he called the Muslim Mosque Incorporated. And then the next day he comes back and says, well, we got Muslim Mosque Incorporated, but I'm going to now create the Organization of African American Unity. And because he had to go beyond the Islamic thing and pick up everybody else who wanted to struggle, wanted to be in part of revolutionary organization. So he had the Muslim Mosque Incorporated for everybody who had to have Islam. Remember what Malcolm said? He said, what did he say about religion? Somebody say it. Keep it in the closet. Keep your religion in the closet, right? So, but he knew that there are a lot of people who were Muslims. That's where his base was. That's where the people who were in the nation who would follow him, they were Muslims. So he created the Muslim Mosque Incorporated. Then he created the Organization of African American Unity, Afro-American Unity. And this was to bring anybody else who could be brought into the organization that he was building. And he was doing this rapidly. He was moving rapidly trying to pull all of this together. And, of course, what happened was that, and I want to just say something about Malcolm recognizing it was white Muslims. Because some people have used that statement to say Malcolm X changed. He changed. All you got to do is listen to Malcolm X, the statements he made after that. When they asked him about that, he was quite strident in his recognizing that African people, black people who we have to organize, black people are the victims here, and that that's who I'm organizing. He said, I'm still the same Malcolm X. There was no question about that. And this whole thing about Malcolm changed, people needed Malcolm to change. And since Malcolm died, a lot of people changed him in ways that he didn't change himself, you know, so they had the opportunity to do that. But Malcolm was incredible. The political integrity of the man was something that resonates even today. Even people who hated Malcolm X had to respect his political integrity. Malcolm was bold and non-compromising in his stance around African people and the oppressed around the world. He recognized the unity between Africans and the oppressed peoples around the world. So he was incredible in that regard. I just want to say that just a couple of things more. One thing I want to mention, I talked to you about King's assassination and I talked to you about Malcolm's assassination. What's really important to understand is that this period of history that we are talking about, that saw Malcolm emerge as this powerful spokesperson for African people, that saw King emerge as this powerful spokesperson for African people. It wasn't that somehow a Baptist preacher and a Muslim minister just dropped out of the sky and started doing this stuff. They were a part of an historical process. And I want to say something quickly about that because you need to know why they died, both of them. And what happened was this thing that I referred to earlier that's called World War II, the Second Imperialist War. When that war happened, at the time that war started, England, little tiny rock England, little backwards, cold, foggy, wet England. England that had so much going for it that as soon as people could get the hell out of there, they did and came here and went to Australia and went to Canada and any other place that would let them in. The original boat people, right, came from England and from Europe, getting the hell out of there. Some people have short memories, but it was poverty and disease that drove Europeans out of Europe. It was poverty and disease. The original boat people were not Haitians. They were not people who were trying to cross the Mediterranean, getting out of Africa to Italy. The Italians were a part of the original boat people. They were the ones who were leaving. Europe that was impoverished, diseased, and unfree, going to other places around the world, raping it, and attaining their freedom and their resources at the expense of African and the other oppressed peoples around the world. You know that, don't you? I know you know it, because you know that there is no such thing as a tea leaf tree in England, and yet England is supposed to be the tea-sipping capital of the world. Where the hell they get the tea from? You understand? So they ain't have nothing until they got you. You understand? So I was going to say, make a point. I did make a point. Right? So England was the most powerful force in the world. They call it the British Empire. They used to brag. This is incredible. They said the British Empire is so great that the sun never sets on it, which means they have slaves in every time zone. And they teach you to hate Hitler. Right? The British bragged about having slaves in every time zone. The sun never sets on the British Empire. We oppress every people all over the world. They used to brag about it. It's harder to brag about it nowadays, but they did. They bragged about it. And so at the beginning of the Second Imperialist War, England was the world monetary system was centered in England. England, Little Rock, England, controlled 25% of the Earth's population. England did. 25% of the world's territory controlled by England, bleeding everybody out. This was England. And then and all of Europe was living off of Africa and other peoples around the world. African people had already been kidnapped. We people in this country, Africans who are here, we, in addition to the so-called Indians, we the only people who didn't come here looking for a better way of life. We lost a better way of life as a consequence of having come here. And so here you have a situation where England controlled most of the world, 25%. France controlled a huge sector of the population of the world, and other European powers did too. Then this war to redivide the world happened. And this war destroyed much of Europe. Much of Europe destroyed through warfare. And then, of course, Japan, which was another power that was involved in this war, because the Japanese said that white people shouldn't control Asia. So Japanese should control Asia, right? And so they were fighting to dominate Asia, and this horrible war went on. The U.S. didn't get into the war until the last minute. By now, Europe has decimated itself nearly. The U.S. drops 2 atomic bombs on Japan, 2 atomic bombs on civilians. How the hell are they going to condemn some poor, starving person in Afghanistan for strapping some dynamite on them and walking into somebody and kill? They dropped 2 atomic bombs that killed more than 100,000 people at each time. Civilians. These were not soldiers they killed. These were civilians. You understand what I'm saying? They're going to talk to us about terrorism. They're going to put you in jail for being at this meeting. Somebody's slipping out. Too late now. So they control most of the whole world. And then what happened was the United States come in late. And all the colonies that Europe used to control essentially by itself, the United States comes in, it ends up now penetrating all those colonies. So raw materials that used to come to Nigeria going only to England, now comes to the United States also. Raw materials that used to come from India going only to the United States, going to England, now comes to the United States also. All over the world, this phenomenon is happening. So the United States, all these resources are coming to the United States. But once it gets here, the question the United States has the greatest productive capacity that it has ever had, ever. since slavery. Then the question comes, how is it going to transform the raw materials into finished products? They used to go to what they call Eastern Europe to get workers, white workers. That's where the term hunky came from. You didn't know that, did you? You thought you made it up, didn't you? No, this is what other white people were calling Hungarians who came to this country, and their hunkies were trying to take their jobs, the Hungarians and what have you, right? So they used to go there, but now at the end of the Second Imperialist War, the white people in Eastern Europe are part of what they call the Soviet what? The Soviet bloc, right? And so they are no longer available. So what happens is to get those workers that they need to transform those raw materials into finished products, they decide they got to get them from the black community down south, but that ain't an easy job to do. Because the economy down south in America, the capitalist economy, is labor intensive. It is based on picking cotton, laying railroad tracks, clearing swamps, doing all the nasty work, keeping the plantations running, and you don't need education, anything for that. You need a permanently oppressed sector of the population where extreme violence is used to control. No rights or anything like that. There. That's us. That's what sent the plantation owners' children to Europe on their vacations. That's what built the colleges for them. That's what made it possible for them to live in luxury, and they're not about to give that up easily by letting Negroes leave the South and go work on a plantation, go work in another factory up north. They're not going to allow Africans to even be able to work in factories in the South. That was prohibited, even in this city right here. In my lifetime, Africans who worked for the city couldn't drive the trucks, couldn't ride on the tractors because you were higher than the white people. Did you know that? So that there are relations of production that are necessary in order to keep a people living in a state of near slavery. You can't have any freedom, no room to wiggle. Because if the people got any freedom at all, they'll use that freedom to get all the freedom that they need. So repression, the extreme violence is absolutely necessary. And so that's what existed here. But now they got to change that. This is where your liberal whites come in. Because they need those workers in those factories for the benefit of production in this country. And an alliance was formed between the liberal sector of the white ruling class and the liberal sector of the African petty bourgeoisie, little bourgeoisie of middle class in this country. That they would support a revolution from above that would free African people from those plantations in the South. Africans, you literally had to escape from the South. Did you know that? Literally had to escape from the South. You had to get away. You had to catch the train that leave the community that you grew up in and walk to another town and catch a train out of there, because if the white folks knew you were leaving, you end up in one of those, what do they call them, where they rent you out? The prisons that they had. No, this was another form. This was pre-chain gang. Convict leasing. That's what would happen to you. So extreme violence, brutality, oppression was necessary. And so they wanted change. And the white liberals wanted change too, but they didn't want no revolution. It had to be a revolution from above. The black petty bourgeoisie, they needed this movement because they needed to be able to integrate into the white social system so that they can get rich like white folks. They lived in cities, like in places, whole counties in Alabama and throughout Mississippi and other places where you had these uneducated white guys who were the sheriffs who ran everything, and tobacco chewing, backwoods, uneducated white people. The only criterion they had was they was white. You had Negroes who had studied all around the world and through every place, and they couldn't do anything but stay scared all the damn time, right? And so they needed change too. And then you had the masses of African people who were constantly being lynched and murdered. You know, wives and children raped. Oh, this is a regular thing that was going on here. Everybody needed change, but for different reasons. The middle class needed change so that they could integrate into the system and they could attain the wealth and resources that white people had, white power had. The middle class needed African people to be able to vote so that they could get elected. The middle class needed you to be able to vote so that they could get elected. And so they came into this alliance. The liberal sector, the white ruling class, funded the civil rights movement, promoted the civil rights movement. They even sometimes sent their children to the South to participate in the civil rights movement, to control it from above. Malcolm talked about that a lot. And what happened, of course, is something they could not anticipate. Because you can't take Fannie Lou Hamer, who was a sharecropper in Mississippi, uneducated sharecropper in Mississippi who became one of the most powerful people in this country. You can't move people like that to change the world without them becoming changed themselves. People who engage in change the world become changed themselves. And then their aspirations go beyond what the black middle class wanted. By 1964, 65, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Bill, all of that stuff had passed. As far as the black petty bourgeoisie was concerned, it was over. They had won everything they were looking for. But 1966, what did you hear? They weren't talking about we shall overcome. They were saying black power. We want black power, which went beyond what the black petty bourgeoisie was talking about. Shook them up. Shook Martin Luther King up. Shook Jesse Jackson up. We said black power. They said soul power. They did. They can, and all the smart white people got instantaneously stupid. Black power, what does that mean? Isn't that something? I mean, these are the most erudite, smart white people you ever wanted, but they don't know what black power means, right? And so you had this incredible movement take off. 1965, Lowndes County Freedom, Lowndes County, Alabama, the Lowndes County Freedom Organization is organized, where people getting tired of being double-crossed by white liberals created an all-black political party called the Lowndes County Freedom Organization. They used as the symbol in Lowndes County, Alabama, because the white Alabama Democratic Party had as its symbol a white rooster, the Lowndes County Freedom Organization used as a symbol the Black Panther. And then they started calling it the Black Panther Party. At this time, they were just trying to win power through the vote. 1966, in Oakland, California, a group of militants there decided that they were going to take the name Black Panther and give it to the party, the Black Panther Party, for self-defense. They called it for self-defense because they were in Oakland, where black people built a ship a day. During this same war that we're talking about, Second Imperialist War, Africans in Oakland, California built a ship a day for Kaiser. We got nothing to show for the ship a day for Kaiser. And when they recruited Africans into Oakland to do that kind of slave work, they also recruited big, hostile, white Southern guys to come up to be on the police department to keep the Africans in check. The Black Panther Party for Self-Defense was created. That was in Oakland, California. Before long, the SNCC's talking about black power, people talking about black power. The Black Panther Party, quoting Mao Zedong, said political power comes from the barrel of the gun. Africans all over this country in motion. 1960s, we had a poll that was done by what was regarded to have been an organ of the CIA called U.S. World and News Report, a weekly news magazine. Did a poll, said 10% of the Africans in this country considered themselves revolutionary. Whoa, that's a hell of a thing. This was in the 60s, when they didn't even have black people working for them, going out and asking people if they thought they were revolutionary. 10% said yes. That's a statement about where things were at the time. And Africans turned our backs on the United States government, politically and ideologically. Africans were building our own organizations, Panther organizations, JOMO in this city. You know about JOMO, Brother Jenkins. Used to run it up and down by your house all the time on Harrington Avenue. Jomo in this city, similar organizations throughout this country. And it shook this country to the foundation. J. Edgar Hoover, who was the director of the domestic secret political police, declared the Black Panther Party the greatest internal threat to the security of the United States. Why? So all they said is that we wanted our freedom, that there's nothing that the Panthers said except we want our freedom. And yet we became a domestic threat, and we are. Black people demanding threat represent a serious domestic threat to the stability and security of the United States, because it cannot survive a struggle for black freedom here or any place else around the world. That's what Malcolm X understood. So here's what happened. You had this incredible movement that turned its back on the United States government. We were building our own organizations. We were coming up with our own philosophy. The high tide of black intellectual thought here and around the world. Fanon, out of Algeria, Nkrumah, in West Africa, Cabral, Baldwin. All of these incredible forces now just seeding the intellectual development of African people and the world. And so, having defeated the U.S. domestically, even the Vietnamese would organize in a way to fight against U.S. imperialism in Vietnam that took advantage of the struggle that African people were making in Detroit. And so the U.S., having lost this ideological and political struggle, turned on us with the gun. And they assassinated Malcolm X. They assassinated Malcolm X, but it was too late. Because it was his influence that created Black Power. It was his influence that created the Black Panther Party. It was his influence that created SNCC, that I was associated, that didn't create SNCC, but the Black Power demand. It was his influence that created JOMO. It was his influence that was the most radical influence of ideological influence throughout this country. And then they had declared that King would be a threat too if he ever abandoned his position of nonviolence. And King on April 4th, 1967 in Riverside Church, it's incredible. April 4th, 1967 in Riverside Church made a speech where he vocally, openly declared the challenge he was having trying to hang on to this nonviolent philosophy, as violent as America was being in Vietnam. And a year to the day, April 4th, 1968, the United States government gunned down King on the balcony, saying, King, the government didn't kill King. Kills everybody else, but it wouldn't kill King, right? Somehow, we're to believe that some white guy who would be in a boarding house that shared the toilet with other people in the boarding house would be able to come in there with a high-powered rifle, sit in the toilet, to wait and know when King was going to come out of the motel on the balcony to get shot. Not fearing that anybody was going to come in there to use it. Somebody had to pee sometime, right? But he doesn't have to worry about that. No, the government killed King. The same government that harassed him and tried to force him to commit suicide, you know they did that, right? The same government that did everything they could to embarrass him, and then even after he was dead, tried to kill him over and over again by running out stuff about his sex life, etc. That's the government that killed King. And they killed Malcolm as well. And so the point that I want to make is that they fell to a counterinsurgency war, that this government was involved in a struggle to stop this revolutionary movement in this country. They killed more than 30 members of the Black Panther Party in 1968 alone. They arrested more than 300 members of the Black Panther Party that year. And there were other people who they killed who were not high profile, like the Panthers, etc. So they had to crush a movement, and Malcolm died in that process. But Malcolm X, it was too late, because the influence of Malcolm X continues to live, and virtually everything that you see that represents revolutionary thought in the African community has been influenced by Malcolm X. And we say it's not good enough to just come out and celebrate Malcolm like this. We must celebrate Malcolm by the way we live. When I say by the way we live, I'm not talking about some religious doctrine. I'm talking Malcolm X, the thing that characterized Malcolm X was one: organization. Malcolm X organization. There was no Malcolm X before there was organization. Malcolm X came into the Nation of Islam. And when he could not be in the Nation of Islam, he built his own organization. I want to say that. I want to say that part of why this is so important is because we are entering into a new high tide of revolutionary struggle. We shouldn't be confused. There are some forces who exist because King died. You wouldn't know about Jesse Jackson. If King had been killed, you wouldn't be saying anything about Jesse Jackson. Jesse Jackson is a hustler King never was. You understand? You wouldn't know about Farrakhan if Malcolm X hadn't been killed. Would be no Farrakhan. And I'm mentioning this, it's important, because Malcolm X was a revolutionary and he talked about revolution. That's what he talked about. That's what he taught. That's the thing that caused the split between him and the Nation of Islam. Farrakhan could have went with him, but he didn't. Farrakhan was his assistant, and he stayed. And not only did he stay, you haven't heard the word revolution come out of Farrakhan's mouth or anybody else who's a part of the Nation of Islam. I'm saying this because some people need to know what it is that you're looking at today. Some people say, when you see a bumper sticker or a poster, it'll say, it'll have on it Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and then Obama, as though they are part of the same trajectory. Listen, as though they are part of the same trajectory. But if you don't know what happened, you won't understand that Obama is a consequence of the defeat of the revolution. He is not a part of the continuation of the revolution. He's part of the defeat of the revolution. And you've got a lot of people out there now not saying anything about revolution, but posturing and holding space and being identified as revolutionary by virtue of the fact they had a relationship of some sort with somebody who was a revolutionary. So we say Malcolm X was organized. That's a critical thing for everybody to understand, because he believed that you got to change the world. But if you're going to change the world, then you have to have an instrument through which you change the world. You just can't change the world by wishing it to happen. So organization is a critical thing. That's why we built the African People's Socialist Party. That's why we exist in various places throughout the world. We do, right now, exist in various places throughout the world. Organization is fundamental. Malcolm X also understood he was a nationalist. Malcolm X said that we have to have our own nation. He said a nationalist wants his own nation, that we don't want to continue to live under some foreign and hostile domination. What kind of human being is it that would willingly and voluntarily give up any kind of sovereignty over his being, over the being of his whole people, or who would give up the right for his children to know freedom, just to go muddle along under domination like this? He said we have to have our own nation. And it is true. And African people are a nation that has been dispersed around the world. There's no such thing as an African American. You can't be an African and American at the same time. That's like being a slave and a slave master. That's a contradiction in terms. You're either an African or you're American. America was built at the expense of Africa and African people. We are Africans. We were Africans when we got on the boat in Africa. We were Africans when we got on off the boat here. Had to be. What happened? What happened in between? What happened on that ship that would change an African into something else? Malcolm X understood this, and he said it. And then also Malcolm X understood, and he said that everywhere he goes, that people are talking about socialism, some kind of socialism, because capitalism by its very nature is rapacious. It's voluntaristic. I think he used the term voluntaristic to describe capitalism. So we're talking about a whole new social system. And I celebrate Malcolm X, and I want to just express so much appreciation for what he has given us. And I hope that we can live like Malcolm, join organization, join the revolution. Let's overturn the system that's responsible for our oppression. Let's give our children an ability to have a life Because the truth of the matter is there's no African on the planet Earth can say with any kind of certainty that my child has a future. None. And we have to guarantee that our children will have a future. And this brother here with this beard who's walking up here with this red, black, and green, he's a threat. He's asking me to be much more disciplined than I've already been. So I thank everybody for coming out and sharing with us the memory of this giant, Malcolm X. Not some black shining prince. We don't need no royalty. Malcolm didn't like royalty. He didn't. He said he just liked those little people. He didn't like those big shots. That's why in the discussion that you just had here in the play, where the guy playing the role of king saying, how is it that every time you say doctor and reverend, you make it sound like a dirty word? And he did that. Malcolm would call you Dr. So-and-so in a minute, and because he had no appreciation for big shots. And so he wouldn't be your shining prince or anything like that. He was Brother Malcolm, Uhuru. Yeah.
Uhuru, Uhuru. Let's give it up one more time. Y'all got to get up and stand up for this, because that was amazing. That was amazing. Thank you, Shirley. Thank you. All right. Y'all came and got fed in more ways than one.